So thank you, Eileen, for allowing me to present as part of this seminar series. I've been involved with coastal resilience planning and implementation since 2015, 2017, primarily through the RAFT or Resilience Adaptation Feasibility Tool. In my capacity as a faculty member here at ODU in the School of Public Service, but also as a Virginia Sea Grant Extension partner. Today, I'm going to talk about the development of the RAFT and share lessons from the RAFT's multi-university partnership that has supported localities of varying sizes, demographics, and capacities. Really drawing from our field experience and also wanting to provide a preview of our forthcoming field guide for community-based and equity-focused resilience planning. It's a mouthful. So I want to highlight how holistic resilience assessments, inclusive engagement, small-scale early win projects, and the integration of equity into local planning processes can catalyze long-term community-led adaptation efforts. So obviously, the audience of this CCPO-ICAR seminar series, we know that coastal communities across Virginia and beyond are vulnerable to sea level rise, coastal hazards, different types of climate impacts. Socially vulnerable populations such as lower income families, the elderly, the medically fragile, racial minorities, they're also disproportionately impacted. And so for many communities, this vulnerability is also compounded by aging infrastructure, by poverty, by limited local capacity. For many of these communities, flooding isn't the only challenge, it's one of many. So communities need help in being resilient and in increasing their capacity to bounce forward in response to shocks, crises, and stressors. So the RAFT is one way that universities, including ODU, are helping communities become more resilient. The RAFT is what we call an innovative collective impact collaborative approach to climate resilience. It's designed to help communities, particularly coastal localities, improve their resilience to flooding and other coastal hazards while remaining economically and socially viable. The RAFT began as a multi-university collaboration involving UVA's Institute for Environmental Negotiation, the ODU Virginia Sea Grant, Virginia Climate Adaptation Resilience Program, and the William and Mary Coastal Policy Center. Today, RAFT continues as this multi-university collaboration with the UVA Institute for Engagement and Negotiation, ODU's ICAR, and the Virginia Tech Coastal Collaborator. The RAFT adopts a three-step process or approach for resilience planning and implementation, and you'll kind of see elements of this throughout the talk as we progress. The first step is to assess resilience through a holistic resilience assessment using a quantitative and a qualitative instrument, but also developing an opportunities list that identifies potential projects for a community to adopt to improve their resilience. Setting priorities is the second step, where now community stakeholders come together, they plan and prioritize resilience projects through a community workshop and develop a resilience action checklist. The third step is the longest part of the RAFT process, and it's 12 months of project implementation to help localities and the communities achieve small wins through implementing specific types of projects. Again, the implementation here is done kind of more community driven, but with support from the RAFT. And we wrap up that RAFT engagement with a community workshop. There's a lot of words on this screen, and it's really just to kind of give you an idea that the RAFT itself, it continues to be developed and improved over time. We started with a RAFT scorecard that went through multiple iterations and continues to be refined. The process also has continued to be refined as we engage with more localities across coastal Virginia and in other parts of the state. And also in terms of application, beyond just local governments, to also include Virginia tribes and all other types of local communities, and expanding it to thinking not just about flooding as a hazard, but also thinking about heat and inland flooding. Since 2018, the RAFT has supported community-driven resilience planning and implementation across Virginia's Eastern Shore, the Northern Neck, the Middle Peninsula, the Crater region, and is currently engaged with localities in the Historic Triangle. The RAFT has also had, as I mentioned earlier, some engagement with the Virginia Indian tribes, including the Mattaponi and the Upper Mattaponi, the Nansemond and the Rappahannock Indian tribes as well. So we're making also inroads, as you can kind of see in these light green localities. We're also making inroads in supporting community resilience in non-coastal communities in Southwest Virginia. So a little bit about our forthcoming book. The book, it's a very long title. The title is Moving the Needle Towards Resilient Coastal Communities, a field guide for community-based and equity-focused resilience planning based on lessons from the RAFT, and is expected to be published by Routledge this summer. The book is a practical field guide for community-based, equity-focused resilience planning and implementation, and building off our experiences with the RAFT, it offers real-world lessons, tools, and examples that communities can adapt and apply to advance equitable resilience in their own communities. So just thinking, the title calls it a field guide, and so this book is for a wide range of audiences, such as residents and community leaders, nonprofit and community-based organizations, philanthropists and funders who are interested in seeing how their resources can support community-driven, equity-centered resilience initiatives, but also people like those of you in the audience, college and university faculty, researchers, and students who want to work with communities or who want to study coastal communities and coastal resilience issues. So let's get started. This presentation revolves around 6 success factors for equitable coastal resilience that we've identified from our work with communities using the RAFT. The first is that equity as both a process and an outcome is at the heart of communities' resilience. Resilience planning begins with a holistic, customized assessment that addresses the specific community's needs. The third factor is that even small projects can have outsized impacts as catalysts for action and also for sustaining momentum for long-term resilience. We also recognize that resilience spans different facets of community planning, and therefore equitable resilience has to be embedded within existing planning processes. Resilience connects across the whole community, and therefore sustained progress requires coordination and continuous coordination across partners and stakeholders. And finally, while we might have federal, state agencies, nonprofits, extension services, colleges and universities, and other organizations that want to and can support resilience efforts, they often need assistance and guidance in how they can actually help communities do so. So let's start with the first one, equity as both a process and an outcome. First, we need to define equity in the context of resilience. And so we can think of that by focusing on 3 key concepts: procedural justice, distributive justice, and recognitional justice. And these basically have to do with who we bring to the table in terms of fair, inclusive decision-making. That's procedural justice. Distributional justice is about the fair allocation of resources and benefits. Where do the benefits, the resources, the infrastructure, the services, where do they go? And then recognitional justice acknowledges and values people's identities and experiences and recognizes that the different people in the community need to be treated differently, are included differently, and that needs to be part of ensuring that resilience and efforts to build resilience value these local assets, that they value public perceptions, that they value the specific expertise that potentially community members that have been historically excluded bring to the table. So all 3 are important for addressing what I call the ghosts of history, right? Where historical inequities, thinking about redlining, thinking about discriminatory zoning, how those dictate the risks that communities face today. And so resilience projects must intentionally address these ghosts of history. Equity is both a process and an outcome. And so equitable processes lead to equitable resilience outcomes. The RAFT's approach, the process that we take, advances equity by fostering community-based and inclusive approaches, by addressing interdependencies and chronic stressors, recognizing that we need a systems approach that acknowledges these interdependencies, and that we also have to connect the dots between coastal hazards and other fundamental needs of the community. Overcoming fragmented planning and policy silos requires approaching resilience as multidimensional and multifunctional. And we'll talk a little bit about that when we talk about the holistic assessment of resilience. And then also the emphasis on continuous learning and adapting, and that an adaptive management approach is critical because these communities face complex, uncertain, and unpredictable challenges. So for each of the 6 factors, I want to highlight lessons learned from our decade of supporting resilience planning and implementation through the RAFT. So in terms of equity, as both a process and as an outcome, we offer 5 lessons. The first is to integrate equity as the foundation and thinking not about equality necessarily, but to equity and justice that is fair according to the specific needs or unique needs. And also then, as we talked earlier, recognizing that those historical inequities and the ghosts drive present day risk for specific segments of the community. We need to frame coastal hazards within the context of chronic stressors like poverty, food insecurity, and transportation barriers, because it's really important to link hazards to social and economic viability. Using comprehensive assessments is a way to also integrate equity directly into resilience metrics, establishing a clear baseline for tracking progress across multiple dimensions. It also calls for broad co-produced engagement, and you'll hear co-production and co-produced again, really kind of thinking about how we balance different power dynamics and how we ensure and bring in local knowledge and scientific, how we bring in local knowledge to supplement scientific data. And then the last one is really thinking about targeted resources, actions, and decisions, and how we prioritize resilience projects based on vulnerability and co-benefits rather than just based on their property value. The traditional ROI calculation generally is based on this idea of property values, then tends to undervalue the benefits of resilience projects to socially vulnerable communities. Okay, so let's move to the second factor, resilience planning and implementation that begins with a holistic assessment of resilience that is customized to the community's needs. So first part is to recognize that coastal resilience is multidimensional, reflecting ecological, social, economic, institutional, infrastructure, and health, and other elements of resilience. And these all contribute. So the assessment of resilience should incorporate these multiple dimensions. The holistic assessment of resilience calls for both a quantitative and a qualitative assessment. The quantitative methods provide the numerical assessments that allows us to maybe compare across localities, which we sometimes do with our RAFT scorecard. But the qualitative methods provide details and insights for a more nuanced assessment, but that tends to be more subjective depending on who is involved in conducting the assessment or providing input into the assessment. So to really think about it, that quantitative data provides the bones for the assessment, the qualitative data provides the heart. So the resulting assessment is one that you want to think about that as balancing both different dimensions. So with the RAFT, we use the RAFT scorecard as the quantitative aspect element for measuring and assessing resilience, and it considers 5 dimensions. Policy leadership and collaboration. This measures whether the existing policies and legislation are existing for resilience, whether coordination happens between different levels of government, and also the accessibility of resilience-related information for residents. The second category of the scorecard is risk assessment and emergency management. And this element examines whether risk assessments have been conducted for different hazards, identifies the vulnerable populations and their needs, and evaluates disaster preparedness and response plans. The third dimension of the scorecard is infrastructure, and whether the locality has already identified methods and plans to protect critical infrastructure. The fourth is planning for resilience, and whether comprehensive plans, zoning codes, other types of ordinances are specifically addressing resilience. And the fifth, which is the broadest category of our scorecard, is community engagement, health, and well-being. And this really looks at the extent to which government and staff have engaged with residents, whether social equity considerations have been incorporated, whether the locality pays attention to health and well-being and other wellness issues during or after a specific event. The qualitative assessment takes place through community listening sessions via interviews and focus groups. And these questions and assessment tend to focus on the environmental, economic, and social resilience aspects of the community. So this just to give you a little bit of an example of the coastal resilience assessment, the qualitative assessment for the Middle Peninsula of Virginia. As part of that qualitative listening approach, we conducted 4 focus groups, 15 interviews, and 20 survey responses spanning 65 individuals from 60 organizations. And some of the questions that are asked, remember, this goes back to the idea of economic resilience, social resilience, environmental resilience. So some of the questions include asking, what resilient strength and assets have you observed in the community? How does your organization work to address resilience? How do we know that what we're doing in terms of resilience is being successful? What are some of the measurable impacts or specific changes? So in addition to the assessment methods, who does the assessment is also important. So our experience with the RAFT identified the importance of university faculty, staff, and students as playing these roles of neutral actors, right? The RAFT scorecard and the scoring itself are done by students under supervision of a faculty member, and then the qualitative listening sessions are also conducted by university staff, faculty, and students. The scorecard results and the qualitative assessment then, because they're being done by these neutral actors, are seen as being more objective assessments that are important for bridging local political divides. When we first started doing the work of the RAFT, there were some communities where you couldn't really even bring up the words climate change, and that might still continue in some of these localities. But because that assessment was done by these neutral actors, there was more of that objectivity embedded within the assessment that therefore then provides this shared baseline that the whole community can trust. So for the 4 lessons learned from the RAFT, first, I just described kind of this importance of prioritizing neutrality and objectivity, ensuring that results are unbiased, and that's really, really important for building community trust and navigating kind of the local political dynamics. Second, there's really the importance of approaching the resilience assessment as a team effort and investing in multifunctional expertise. Resilience, think about that definition of multidimensionality. Resilience is too broad for any one department to assess alone. So you need a robust assessment that calls upon a team with diverse skills and diverse knowledge to manage that scoring or that assessment. And then adopting that broad definition of resilience, ensuring that the assessment is comprehensive, that it covers the many dimensions that are important and relevant to the community. And when we work with communities, we partner with the regional planning organization. And this is really important to leverage these partnerships because the staff of the regional planning organization, they might be able to provide essential local knowledge that your team might not have. They can facilitate introductions to key government personnel, and then also help navigate the vetting of the results with the different governing boards. So the third success factor is one of my favorites. It's the importance of recognizing that even small projects can have outsized impacts as catalysts. So the key point here is that small, well-chosen projects. They build trust, they demonstrate progress, and they set the stage for sustained long-term resilience action. As part of the RAFT process, we support the implementation of resilience projects for 12 months. And over this period, we facilitate implementation by focusing on projects that can finish or that can start within that year period. And this approach is successful because small achievable projects can help move the needle on resilience while building confidence in the overall process. Our goal is to build momentum and prove that progress is possible. And we do that by normalizing conversations around resilience, by implementing projects that break down silos that can help catalyze follow-on actions or that demonstrate tangible value or that progress itself is possible. So here's an example of an example from the town of Cape Charles in Virginia, where a resilience education workshop was conducted for town leaders. It was a modest investment of time and effort, but it yielded transformative results. At the time, resilience wasn't a common topic for discussion in the town, and attempts to raise these issues often didn't really go very far. So we organized a focused workshop to introduce participants to resilience concepts, to review the town's scorecard and those results, and also to facilitate dialogue on what would be some good resilience priority actions. In terms of impacts, this workshop normalized resilience as a topic for conversation, making it a legitimate and urgent topic, and enabled town leaders to speak openly about long-term risks and opportunities. But it also broke down these professional silos in a small town where individuals often wore multiple hats, but that hadn't really pulled together those different hats to discuss resilience much more collectively. And finally, there was some policy change. Town council agreed to begin developing a resilience plan. And the town manager reported that the town's preparedness for an imminent hurricane had improved significantly as a direct result of the workshop. So this illustrates that small, well-designed engagement can shift mindsets, foster collaboration, and lay the groundwork for longer-term systemic change. In another example, this comes again also from the Eastern Shore, but where there was a regional effort to address chronic road flooding because road flooding was a substantial problem that disrupted transportation, commuting, emergency access. The small towns on the Eastern Shore for many years had struggled to resolve those issues, largely due to confusion over jurisdiction and ineffective communication with the State Department of Transportation. And so what we found was that localities were contacting the wrong offices. They also didn't have a strong channel for dialogue with VDOT. So the solution was simple: a single facilitated meeting that brought together local government representatives and the appropriate DOT contacts. It clarified the roles, clarified the responsibilities, and also established a new communication channels between towns and the VDOT staff. The impact was immediate in terms of the installation of projects that had previously stalled but were now being invigorated. And it really, the other part that was really important was that it really helped establish these stronger relationships between the towns and with their regional and state partners. We had a unique opportunity. So this is another favorite of mine. We had a unique opportunity to pilot a resilience grant program with support from the Jesse Ball DuPont Fund. They set aside about $150,000 in funds for the RAFT to provide micro and mini grants for small projects in the $5,000 to $25,000 range that could advance regional resilience priorities within the region. We were able to invite local governments, tribes, regional organizations, and community and nonprofit organizations across 10 counties in the Northern Neck and the Middle Peninsula to apply for these grants. A key point about the mini and micro grants is that really these small grants, the small amount of funds, can be transformative for community organizations, nonprofits, and small localities. One example is the Upper Mattapanai Indian tribe and their fish hatchery. Under one of the mini grant applications, they were requesting funds to complete the repair of their fish hatchery, which had long been in need of revamping and support, and it was a really key part of their culture. They were expecting that kind of repair of the fishery would be able to contribute to the resilience of the tribe by supporting economic sustenance and supporting their food supply. So the lessons are simple for this one. That small is beautiful and simple is beautiful, where the simplest solutions may be the most effective, but also the least expensive, and that they can offer easy wins and catalyze community and local government support. And as just described, the micro and the mini grants, they can be powerful motivators for local organizations and maybe all that is needed for that locality or that community to accomplish their resilience goals. However, as all of us have probably applied for grants in different shapes or form, we recognize that it's also really important to make sure that the grants are accessible by keeping the application process and the reporting simple. In addition to ensuring equity, this also allows us to focus on the impact and not just bureaucracy. All right, transitioning to the fourth factor, resilience spans different facets of community planning, and equitable resilience can be mainstreamed and embedded within existing planning processes. Mainstreaming means embedding resilience into the everyday local policy and decision-making processes rather than treating it simply as a standalone or separate initiative, right? And so mainstreaming allows communities to use their current or their existing planning instruments to achieve resilience goals. So for example, a hazard mitigation plan can identify hazard risk and needed investments in hazard mitigation, while a water supply plan can provide the guidance for infrastructure investment. And this ensures that resilience is built into the community's established workflow and their budget cycles. Embedding resilience in this way prevents siloed and contradictory actions across departments and plans. So the key point here is really to think about how you can use existing planning processes and plans as the foundation for your resilience planning. Equitable resilience, however, calls for embedding equity within the planning process, not just in the resulting plan. And so our experience with the RAFT suggests 4 ways that this can be accomplished. The first two is to engage trusted messengers. These are community leaders, faith-based leaders, local nonprofit agency staff, to use them to reach vulnerable populations and to overcome distrust and language barriers. It really is, I think, in this sense, important to acknowledge that some communities have been historically excluded or exploited by government planning processes, and an explicit focus on embedding equity in the planning process is crucial. Embedding equity also requires combining technical assessments with grassroots input that recognizes people's lived experiences. So this dual approach then results in plans and projects that are data-driven, maybe coming out of a quantitative resilience assessment or some other scientific assessments, but that also are community-driven. Then also using the visuals and plain language in public engagement to ensure accessibility of information so that everyone who participates in the planning process do so with a level playing field. And then framing resilience in terms of co-benefits that allows us to think about how we can close the resource and the wealth gap. This, for example, could be thinking about linking flood mitigation to economic development, to transportation improvement, or to public health, which in addition also helps gain broader support for those specific projects. So just thinking about breaking the planning silo, resilience planning can be mainstream and embedded in a range of different plans, such as the comprehensive plan, the hazard mitigation plan, the capital improvement plan, connecting it to infrastructure investment, or other plans such as the transportation plan, a green infrastructure plan, healthcare plan, but we can also have a standalone resilience plan as one that that also integrates components from other plans. So in terms of mainstreaming resilience, we offer 3 lessons learned. The first is that mainstreaming resilience leverages existing mandates and plans. And since communities already have to update their comprehensive plan, they already have to update their hazard mitigation plans for compliance. And therefore, when we think about embedding resilience into these plans and processes, we can do so without creating new planning burdens, saving time and resources. Another lesson is that equity must be operationalized and not just stated, right? And our qualitative assessments and our whole community approach ensure that vulnerable populations are part of the process for setting resilience priorities. But the process also explicitly includes equity consideration in resilience assessment, in identifying resilience projects, and in prioritizing these projects. And this approach builds procedural and distributive justice into resilience planning. So for example, the RAFT community workshops and the implementation teams often include social service agencies. They also include grassroots leaders to ensure that equity concerns are reflected in the prioritized actions. A resilience plan can draw from existing plans. You don't have to always start from scratch, right? Communities with resources and capacity can create standalone resilience plans that serve as an integrative document. But you can also approach resilience planning as drawing from existing plans and still be integrative and putting resilience at the center. So for example, you might already be able to pull from the risk assessment from the hazard mitigation plan into a resilience plan. You might be able to include information from the comprehensive plan to think about the environmental aspects of resilience and pulling all of those together into a resilience plan without having to create a standalone resilience plan. The 5th factor emphasizes that resilience connects across the whole community. And if you want to think about sustained progress in resilience, we have to think about how do you continue to coordinate across partners and stakeholders in the longer term. So equitable resilience calls for participation across the whole community, including local government, community services, health providers, and also connecting various sectors and functions, such as those related to food security, health, housing, transportation, emergency management, to ensure that resilience actions address the needs of vulnerable populations holistically. Additionally, in the early days of resilience building efforts, you might need to think about how you work with a coalition of the willing to launch and get these efforts started. Working with these smaller, less representative coalitions is okay, and they can help create some of that early momentum that to demonstrate value and to deliver in the shorter term or near term outcomes. But it really is crucial to make sure that you have a clear strategy for how you can extend participation as resilience efforts take hold. Another really key point here is to recognize that success and working across the whole community in one locality doesn't guarantee success elsewhere. At that whole of community engagement needs to recognize cultural norms, leadership patterns, community histories to be effective. And so one size fits all doesn't work if you don't recognize because it doesn't recognize these nuances and context. Through our work with the RAFT, we found that that capacity constraints are the biggest barrier to sustaining resilience efforts, right? Local government staff and others, they have limited time. They can't always maintain the ongoing coordination without additional support or facilitation. So as coordination itself is infrastructure, and therefore facilitation is a core infrastructure requirement, it's not optional. It's not a nice to have. You really need to think about being integral and embedded within the process. Sustained resilience requires someone to schedule meetings, maintain communication, follow up on actions, and hold the network together. So what we've been recommending with the RAFT is for communities to think about sustaining progress through developing a resilience committee that will outlive any single grant or any single project. Now that sounds easier than said than done. So we'll talk a little bit about that in the lessons learned. The first lessons learned, as I mentioned, is you have to know one size fits all. So you have to customize the whole community engagement to fit the local context. But also being realistic about local government capacity and how local government might or might not be able to engage and plan for alternative leadership pathways. These might be thinking about how nonprofit organizations or other community leaders might be able to step up and fill the void. A critical lesson learned is to recognize that participation has real costs and that you need to allocate resources accordingly. Expecting sustained engagement without compensation can disproportionately exclude lower income residents, nonprofit staff, tribal representatives, and other community leaders who already carry multiple responsibilities. So our team has invested differently in honoraria, stipends, pay liaison, or community builder roles, but not looking at these as incentives necessarily, but as equity tools that acknowledge the real trade-offs that people make to participate in resilience planning and implementation. Investing time in broadening or expanding existing networks or initiatives is also critical for equity and equitable resilience. And then I wanted to wrap up this particular set of lessons learned with this idea that it's important to pair long-term resilience goals with sustained investment in people and not just in plans. Resilience plans, resilience committees, or resilience work groups, they can't be sustained through short-term funding or projects alone, right? So our experience shows that durable, equitable resilience requires ongoing investment in people who can do the convening, the translating, and the connecting across sectors. So finally, federal and state agencies, and I've talked about other potential support partners, they want to help, but they need assistance and guidance in how they can help effectively. So first, thinking about how we can leverage university resources effectively, different engagement models have to be matched to the community's needs. So thinking about class projects, internships, applied research projects, participatory research projects, they all have different advantages for addressing different types of projects. But also universities and communities sometimes speak different languages and they work on different timelines. And so our academic semesters don't always align with community timelines. And when communities need support, doesn't necessarily always align with the types of courses that we're offering at any given point in time. I want to talk about the handoff mentality because here there is sometimes the assumption that we complete the project and we deliver the output and it's done. And this approach really treats knowledge production as kind of this endpoint rather than a step in longer implementation process. So the handoff of just a report or just a memo or some data doesn't necessarily help communities when it's not actionable, when it's not something that they can take on and implement or use as a decision tool for next steps in resilience planning. So key lessons learned here are that relationships matter more than products. So the strength of the relationship, and this is sometimes, I think, where a lot of times the university and the community fail to meet to make a lasting partnership, is really that what matters here is not just that final product, right? Trust, clear communication, long-term engagement, mutual respect. These are the foundations of what makes a useful product coming out of a project and building that relationship. So communities are more likely to use and act on outputs when they trust the people who produced this output and that they felt heard in the process of creating that particular output. So the other part, as I mentioned, not all university engagement is the same. And choosing the wrong model can sometimes undermine even well-intentioned efforts. So thinking about how you can choose the lightest weight or the best match to meet the community's need is really important to reduce the burden, to manage the expectations, and to increase the likelihood of a follow-through. Intermediaries or boundary spanners like the RAFT adds real value. This is a really critical role in translating between academic and community, the different perspectives to help align the expectations and reduce friction moving forward. Sometimes these boundary spanners or intermediaries also support coordination tasks that neither the academic side or the community side are well positioned to handle alone. So thinking about, for example, scoping or making connections and building relationships. Timeline management is critical because misalignments can derail a specific project. And so community needs are driven by grant deadlines, by the fiscal years, by political cycles, by hazard events. But university timelines are shaped by academic calendars, student availability, research funding cycles. So trying to find the match between the two can sometimes be challenging if you don't deliberately plan for those. Also, thinking about a key lesson learned is that equity requires intentional design in the project. So equity must be intentionally built into how the collaborations are structured and resourced. A lot of these under-resourced communities, they want the help, but they often face the greatest risk and having the least capacity to engage in these types of in these types of partnerships. So successful partnerships need to acknowledge the costs and also to minimize the cost by narrowing the project scopes, by reducing meeting demands, and providing coordination support. I've talked about the other two just previously, so we're going to basically kind of wrap up with just kind of a reminder of the 6-factor roadmaps that come out of the RAFT experience over the last decade or so. And that is my presentation. I welcome questions.